Good morning and good afternoon, and welcome to City Watch, a watchdog program for social, economic, political, and cultural issues here in New York City. I'm your host today, Jeff Simmons, and I'd like to welcome you to the show. Each week we explore a variety of topics. Sometimes we go political, sometimes cultural, and often the topics we choose are inspired by the events that have recently transpired or possibly relate to a designated day or month. And today is known as Holocaust Remembrance Day, January 27th. In 2005, the UN General Assembly declared January 27th as International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and this represents the anniversary of the 1945 liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest Nazi concentration camp. This is a day to honor the Jewish victims of the Holocaust and the millions of other victims of Nazism. And for many, this is a solemn occasion. For others, a day to combat historical ignorance. It was recently that a survey had come out by the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, and that found a surprising lack of knowledge about the Holocaust. In fact, one of the statistics was that most Americans, about 80%, have never visited a Holocaust museum. And that brings us to our first guest today. I'd like to welcome to our show Bruce Ratner, who has been a member of the board of the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust since 1996, and he served as chairman for the last 4 years. He was the founder, chairman, and CEO of Forest City Ratner Companies, which many of you may have heard of, a New York-based real estate development company, which he started in 1985. And just a few days ago, the museum announced a groundbreaking exhibition, Auschwitz Not Long Ago, Not Far Away, that will be unveiled in early May and which had garnered significant attention and attendance during its extended run in Spain. Welcome to City Watch, Mr. Ratner.
Thank you very much, Jeff, and thank you for having me on City Watch. I very much appreciate it.
So I described it as groundbreaking. How is this exhibition groundbreaking?
I think your initial comments were apt. First thing is to recognize it was 74 years ago today that Russian soldiers came upon a place that had not really been much in the knowledge of people, which was Auschwitz. And they found a deserted camp, deserted except for bodies, except for about 7,000 prisoners who were too weak to go on a death march initiated by the Nazis who ran that camp, a place where there were crematoria, where there were barracks, where inhuman torture was occurring, where people slept 80 to a small bunk, where there was virtually no food, where people were starved to death, and so on, where 1 million Jews died and another 100,000 Roma and Polish citizens. So it is as you correctly said, a day of memory, but it is also a day to look upon what happened there as lessons learned and how we make sure that such events do not occur again.
So the exhibition itself, how did the museum learn about it? How did you find out about it? Did you visit it over in Spain?
So a friend of mine on the board, George Klein, had been invited to see the exhibit, which was in Madrid. And when he came back, he described it to the board. And so I went with someone named Abe Foxman, who was the former Anti-Defamation League head, to Madrid and spent 2 days there. And I saw this extraordinary exhibit. The exhibit was something which had over 500,000 visitors over the 9-month period that it's run. It's an exhibit where I think the right way to describe it is Abe and I came out sobbing. It was memorable in its sadness, memorable in the lessons that we learned and the history that we saw. And as we watched people go through the exhibit, they would take 2 hours and 3 hours. One of the more memorable aspects of the exhibit was just watching on video the testimony of the survivors, of some of the survivors, and the testimony of experts talking about it. So it was both a very sad thing to go there, but also eye-opening. And I realized, as the members of our board, that this was an exhibit which belonged in New York City. And so we added to the exhibit by adding about 100 and so objects to the 600 that were already there, objects that were collected from the Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum, which is actually the Auschwitz site in Poland, as well as 20 other institutions from around the world. So it's an exhibit that's extensive. It has both large objects and small objects, videos, photographs, artwork of survivors.
So, considering the timing of this and the climate of our country, what goes through your mind about the importance of this exhibition at this period in our history?
I think the simple but important statement is this is what can result from hate, and discrimination, and bigotry, because that's where it really starts. This did not, the murder of the Jews, 6 million Jews and 1 million at Auschwitz, was not something that was just born and occurred because of Adolf Hitler. It was something that had been building up in Europe and much of the world for centuries and centuries. And so it's pertinent to what's happening in this country, not only over the last couple of years, but for a period of time. We've had racial issues in this country for literally centuries. We don't have a wonderful history with respect to race and respect to even genocide, whether it be Native Americans or whether it be the slavery that much of this country, unfortunately, was built upon. And right now, anti-Semitism in this country is on the rise. Pittsburgh, of course, being the sad moment which much of this came to pass. Some of the comments that you hear people, the alt-right, which is an organized movement, a movement that the FBI has said is in a lot of ways much more important than the terrorism that we've experienced here in this country.
There are fewer Holocaust survivors who are still living, and so the collective memory is fading. How does the exhibition guard against that fading of memory?
So memory, of course, is the way that we remember people, remember sadness and so on. Survivors that was 74 years ago that it was liberated, so the survivors are anywhere from, in the young or lower 80s all the way up to 90 and 100. And so, of course, the specific memory and recollection is gone with them. And so that's very sad. But it isn't only the sadness of many survivors who we're now losing and those who we already lost, but it's really what they had to teach us and their eyewitness accounts that has to be kept and really looked at, listened to, and warned against happening again. So it is not only the memory in terms of the individuals, but it's their, when you hear a Holocaust survivor tell their story, it is inexplicably difficult to listen to sometimes, what they went through, the unusual way in which an individual survived. There's a similarity to each story, but there's differences with every single story. And each story has its own little lesson. It could be a lesson of kindness by somebody. It could be a lesson of cruelty. It could be a lesson in how an individual who loses their entire family can manage to make it through that horrible, horrible time and come out and be in the United States and be a citizen of a country where they are able to thrive and have opportunity. So it encompasses so many things, the loss of memory.
So the survey that I had mentioned at the outset of the show had talked about how a number of Americans had not even visited a Holocaust museum. And another statistic had been that more than 4 in 10 millennials believe that substantially fewer than 6 million Jews had been killed during the Holocaust. How is it, give me a sense of how institutions such as the museum can help to educate a younger generation and to keep this memory alive?
So with all these comments about fake news, I saw a survey which said that one of the areas where people still believe in the veracity and the truthfulness of what they see or read are museums, because museums have a standard of accuracy that is built on spending a great deal of time on making sure that every exhibit is as accurate as possible. So museums are a very important way for people to learn today, in some ways more so than ever. And also they are live in the sense that you're walking and seeing with a community of people as opposed to simply seeing something on a video or on your iPhone and so on. So they become incredibly important. And your comment about millennials and their lack of recognition of the Holocaust, it is not an unusual fact. I mean, these are people in their 20s and so on. And this was, again, 74 years ago. So it's not surprising, but we have to take that fact and do something about it. And what we can do about it is make sure our museums describe the social history of not only the Holocaust, but our country, and some of the difficult issues that we faced both here and in Europe. And so for millennials, it's not a blame issue. It's an opportunity to really teach and show them what actually occurred. Because I like to say, history doesn't really repeat itself exactly. We're not likely to have gas chambers anymore. But it is something else. We have massacres, we have genocide, whether it be in Rwanda or Myanmar, or whether it be in Cambodia, or whether it be Bosnia, or whether it be Rwanda or the Congo. So these things still go on. In fact, in the last 25 years, there have been at least 6 or 7 major massacres, mass murders, or genocides. And so despite the fact that we have lessons to be learned from the Holocaust, we have not really sufficiently learned them. And I think for millennials, they are eager to find out this kind of information. We have a very active group of millennials, and both in terms of their politics, their interest in government. So it's a wonderful opportunity for museums like ours to be able to tell the kind of history which is so important, which I know all of us want to know more about.
And to be able to tell this history of Auschwitz, from what I understand, you're going to have to take down the museum's permanent exhibition temporarily during this run, correct?
I'm glad you brought that up, Jeff. This is what I call a major exhibition, both in its size and its scope. So we are taking out our entire exhibition, core exhibition, our that's been up for 20 years, and we are installing this exhibition, even though this will only be planned to be a 9-month exhibit. We're doing that because it's so important. And just think about that, 700 objects, 100 of which are our own, and 600 come from 20 institutions all over the world. So some of the objects, artifacts that are seen here have never been seen before and are both moving and important to tell the story.
And you mentioned survivor testimonies earlier. Is my assumption correct that they will still be a part of this?
Very much so. There will be many survivor testimonies. You know, we have an annual luncheon, a women's luncheon, every year at the museum, and I go, and a survivor tells her story and usually has her family there. And I think in the many that I've been to, I never fail to break down when I listen to the story and how a woman is able to survive and get through losing so much and still be a productive human being in society. But I should mention that the exhibit, often been asked what is particularly memorable. Well, there's so many things that are memorable, and the story that I tell, I think, was the most moving of all. Was there in the exhibit you will see a shoe, a little boy's shoe, really a toddler's shoe, and in it is a sock. And that shoe was a shoe that was left by a little boy, probably 5, 6, 7 years old, who took his shoes off to be led to the gas chambers unknowingly. And he left his little sock in the shoe. And to see that and realize that this little boy left his shoe in that kind of way, and to see the reality of him leaving his sock as he was taught. Or there was another exhibit object, which is a tin wedding, what looks like a wedding ring, and it was given when an engaged couple were transported to different places, one to Auschwitz, one to elsewhere. And he gave her a little tin ring that he was able to make in the ghetto and in the camp that they were in. And she kept it. She hid it under her tongue. Despite being searched and so on by the Nazis, she was able to keep it through her survival at Auschwitz. After the war, she looked for her betrothed, and but could not find him. He did not survive. She kept that ring always, and now we have that artifact, that object in the museum to look at. And it's very touching, or whether it be little buttons. We also will have the rail freight car, which transported the Jews from ghetto to ghetto, from camp to camp, and many ultimately to Auschwitz. So we actually have a rail car similar to the type from that same period that was used to transport the Jews. And when you see that freight car and the way that people were transported, many were put into a single car. Many died on a 20 and 30-hour trip sometimes with virtually nothing to eat, crammed into a freight car. It's hard stuff to see, but important stuff to see.
As you think about the exhibition, do you reflect on your own family's history, and how were you, your family, how were you touched by the Holocaust?
Well, my father was born in Eastern Europe. He was fortunate to come before the war from a town called Białystok, and my mother family came from Warsaw, again, before the war. But unfortunately, our family lost over 40 members, 40 relatives who died in Auschwitz alone. Well over 100 members of our family were lost in the Holocaust, of which 40 from Auschwitz. So obviously, I didn't know these people. I was born in 1945, actually, just before the liberation of the camp. So I didn't know them. But to see the stories, people who were children who were 3 years old who were relatives, or my grandparents' brothers and sisters, or people who would have been my first or second cousins who died at Auschwitz. So it has that meaning, just realizing that so much of my family was really left there and murdered.
So we've got just a few minutes left. I do want to ask you about Holocaust Remembrance Day, but before I do that, as we're talking about this, I should be asking you also, if people are hearing this and they want to find out more or purchase tickets, where do they go?
So the best way to buy tickets is to go online. The website is Auschwitz.nyc. Auschwitz.nyc. You can go online. The exhibition prices were made low. Most of these exhibitions are $25, $35. Here they're $16, less for seniors, less for groups, and school children go for free. So, again, it's Auschwitz.nyc. It will open on May 8th and will continue through the year, through the end of the year. So it's an exhibition that should not be missed. We get 50 million tourists in the city. So that's another reason to have it in New York, because not only for our region is it important, but the many tourists who come here. The museum you can see the Statue of Liberty from the museum, as well as Ellis Island, as well as 9/11 Museum is in the same area. So it's an area of sadness, but also an area of hope.
And final thoughts about Holocaust Remembrance Day. What, if there's one message about today that you want people to take away, what would that be?
Remember those who did not survive, remember the survivors, but equally important is to remember that we need to resist authoritarian governments. We need to fight against hate and bigotry to make sure that things similar to the Holocaust or similar to some of the massacres and genocides that are happening today do not happen again, and that we must make sure to welcome some of the 40 million refugees all over the world looking for a decent and calm, peaceful way to live.
Bruce Ratner, member of the board, chair of the board of the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust since 1996. Thank you for joining me, Jeff Simmons, here on City Watch.
And thank you very much, Jeff. Thank you so much.
So in a few moments, we're going to bring up our second guest to talk a little more about Holocaust education. The museum exhibition, was timed, from what I had read, was timed to coincide in May with the end of the war. And the announcement, which just took place a few days ago, was timed to just come out right before Holocaust Remembrance Day today. I just wanted to, as we wait for our second guest to call in, wanted to just talk a little more about that survey that I had mentioned before. This was been by the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, and that found that while there were 40,000 camps and ghettos during the Holocaust, nearly 50% of millennials could not name a single one. The major findings of that survey were that 7 out of 10 Americans, that's about 70%, said fewer people seem to care about the Holocaust than they used to, and that a majority of Americans, 58%, believe that something like the Holocaust could happen again, which was an astounding statistic. So our next guest is on the line. We're going to bring him in just a moment. This is New York City Council member Chaim Deutsch. He represents the New York City Council's 48th District, and that includes Brighton Beach, Manhattan Beach, Sheepshead Bay, Homecrest, and Midwood. The councilman is a lifelong Brooklynite who's been at the forefront of a number of major initiatives throughout the city, including the Get Alarmed NYC campaign to outfit every home in the city with a smoke alarm. He also worked with the NYPD to launch the online program program to provide New Yorkers with free access to vehicle collision reports. He's also the chair of the Council's Jewish Caucus, and recently I had seen that he led a Council committee hearing on a resolution to recognize today as International Holocaust Remembrance Day and declare this week as a citywide week of Holocaust education. Welcome to City Watch, Council Member. Welcome to City Watch. How are you? Do we have the council member on the line?
Yeah, hi. How you doing?
There you are. Okay. So, council member, thank you for joining me today. I understand that the hearing that I just mentioned was a packed room. Can you tell me a little about the hearing, who showed up, who talked about the significance of designating this day?
So we had a hearing on my resolution. It was Resolution 673 that will acknowledge International Holocaust Remembrance Day here in New York City. And we heard from Holocaust survivors, Holocaust survivor advocates, and students speaking about the importance of Holocaust education, and the Holocaust should never be forgotten. If you look back and you look at how many people know what happened in World War I, no one knows. And now that Holocaust survivors are dwindling here in New York City, we won't be able to hear firsthand accounts from Holocaust survivors. So it's important to bring this to New York City. Although you have International Holocaust Remembrance Day, it brings a personal, symbolic feeling here in New York City where it brings conversation. People are talking about it on social media. And only today, with thousands of people just on social media talking about Holocaust Remembrance Day, how it should never be forgotten.
And going back to the hearing for a moment, were there any one individual story that impacted you the most, that affected you?
So, every story that was told by the Holocaust survivors had a really had an impact on everyone present, everyone watching the hearing. But there was one young adult who came out. Her name was Janaya, and she comes from a very secular family who really doesn't understand or have that tradition, that Jewish tradition at home. And she was at an aunt's house, and she came out with candelabras, Shabbos candles. And she asked her aunt, where are these Shabbos candles from? And she said, well, your great-grandmother brought this from, right after the war. And she said she could have came with valuables, she could have came with money, she could have came with anything, and she came back with Shabbat candles. And that alone was very meaningful because people left or escaped the Holocaust coming in with the things that were important to them based on their religion. And that really hit me really hard, and it gave me chills down my spine. So that was very meaningful. And she also was crying she was literally crying at the hearing, saying, I can't believe that there's so many people who don't know about the Holocaust.
And in fact, that's, one of the things that became very clear from the survey that I've been talking about on the show today. So then what is the solution? If we're hearing that a number of people don't even know about the Holocaust, or are ill-informed, or do not have a much, different sense of how many people were impacted by this, what are some of the solutions? What can be done?
So, I'm sure you've heard this before, that 56% of American millennials don't know what Auschwitz is, and that's a kind of scary thought, that people don't know. And I've seen videos on social media where people were asked a question about what is Auschwitz, and people had no idea. They had no idea what Auschwitz is. They thought it was the name of a food product. We need to bring, especially now, at this time when we have here in New York City, for example, 45,000 Holocaust survivors, even while they are still living amongst us, Holocaust education is not that widespread. And many people here in New York City, 8.6 million New Yorkers, many don't even know what happened during the Holocaust. So it's important for us to recognize that, the Holocaust survivors that are here, and every year we have about 4 or 5 Holocaust memorials just alone in my district, and I see older people, more of the elderly community coming and being part of that. And I want to see more young adults. I want to see more children coming out. And this way we can teach our children more about what happened, the atrocities, the genocide that happened against 6 million Jews, including 1.5 million children. And this is something we need to know. We need to pass this on from generation to generation. And, we all know the saying that those who do not learn history are doomed to repeat it. And we see now more and more incidents of hate are widespread. Here in New York City, hate, there was an increase of 5% of hate crimes overall, and 28% increase on anti-Semitic hate crimes. So when someone scrolls a swastika out in the street, they may see that swastika on social media and not knowing the impact of what happens if they scroll that swastika, how it impacts a person, how it impacts a Holocaust survivor, and how it impacts a community. By educating the younger generation, that will bring more exposure of what happened during the Holocaust and what is the meaning of the swastika. So I believe, those hate crimes will drastically go down when people are more educated about, how it impacts the community, and I think it's important to teach them to go out and really, this is a partnership. It's not just one person doing something. It's everyone working together, making sure that people know what happened during World War II.
It's interesting because I went to a public school in high school in New Jersey, and I don't know if it was part of the curriculum, but one thing that I do recall was meeting my first Holocaust survivor who had visited our class to be able to speak to us. And, and I think of Bruce Ratner a few minutes ago talking about the importance of survivor testimonies. It's that type of personal connection that I think resonates very much with especially with younger folks who might not have known about this or much about this before.
Most definitely, I agree. And, in the New York City Council, I'm currently the chair of the Veterans Committee. And when a new speaker came in, they gave out the committees we have over 35 standing committees, and I chose to be the chair of the Veterans Committee for a simple reason, because my father was liberated on May of 1945 by the 71st Infantry Division of the United States Army. So now I felt it's my time to give back to those veterans. You had tens of thousands of people were liberated by the United States Army, and we need to give back. We need not only to thank those that protected the Jews during the Holocaust, but we need to also educate everyone of what happened during the Holocaust.
Growing up, what did your parents tell you about their experience?
So my father in particular survived 3 concentration camps, Auschwitz, Mauthausen, and Gerichtskirchen. His childhood was stolen from him. As a child, people play with toy guns. He actually had real guns pointed at him. He had no childhood. He didn't have too much emotion when it came to, giving a hug. This is how he was brought up. He was brought up in a time that we would never fathom of how or what went on during the Holocaust. We could just talk about it, listening to the survivors. But we cannot imagine of what they went through. So my father didn't really speak much. Most of the things that I learned was secondhand because he did speak to others about what happened to him during the Holocaust. But I guess he didn't want us to feel the guilt. And so he didn't really speak much about it at home.
So you've been listening to me, Jeff Simmons, here on City Watch on WBAI New York 99.5 FM and streaming live at WBAI.org. I'm on with New York City Council member Chaim Deutsch, who is the chair of the council's Jewish Caucus. So just going back to educating students about this. From what I understand, you'll be visiting schools this week, and what are like the key messages you want them to take away when you visit the schools?
So part of my resolution is not only for New York City to acknowledge International Holocaust Remembrance Day today, but it's a week of Holocaust education. I'm asking educators, I'm asking parents, I'm asking New Yorkers to try try to educate the younger generation of the atrocities of what happened during the Holocaust. So I will be visiting Madison High School. I believe it's going to be on Tuesday at 2 o'clock, speaking to a class and going in there with 2 Holocaust survivors and telling them the experience that I know of my father, of what I've learned, of what my father went through during the Holocaust, as well as them listening to Holocaust survivors directly from their own personal experience.
So just a little while ago, you mentioned the rise in incidents, and it's been a significant concern that in our city, I think it was 22% increase last year. Why do you think it's not just education? I mean, why are people feeling more empowered and able to commit acts of anti-Semitism, whether it's through violence or graffiti? Why is this happening now, in your view?
So you had a 28% increase in 2018 against Jews, and from that 28%, approximately 16 of them were violent acts against individuals. And yes, anti-Semitism, we can't deny, is on the rise. Those assaults, when someone gets assaulted, we need to get to the root of the problem of why someone would assault and punch someone and knock him to the floor or her on the floor, only because that individual is Jewish. So we need to get to the root of that problem, as well as other incidents that happen that are deemed a hate crime, is when someone scrawls a swastika. I believe if you divide it into 2 parts and you look at those that scroll a swastika, I think that could be eliminated by doing Holocaust education, because most of the time when someone does get caught, it's a young person who really doesn't know the meaning of what a swastika is. And when you're talking about someone that does commit a violent act against an individual because that person, because he represents a certain culture, we need to bring more tolerance here in New York City. And the fact is that in New York City, we have people coming from 150 different countries, speaking more than 80 different languages, and more than 40% of New Yorkers are immigrants. So we need to learn how to live together, how to better understand each other's culture, and I think that is a factor in it. If we all understand other cultures that we live side by side and work side by side with, I think we'll have a better understanding, and we'll be able to bring in tolerance and reduce the amount of hate crimes in New York City.
Whose responsibility do you believe it is to preserve the memory of the Holocaust?
So I think it's all of our responsibilities to preserve the memories of the Holocaust. And when you look at the Jewish nation, when 6 million was slaughtered, and you think about 1.5 million children, 1.5 million children. This is all of our responsibilities to educate the public about what happened, the genocide, the atrocities that happened during the Holocaust.
So we've got just a few minutes left, and you, as I mentioned, are chair of the council's Jewish Caucus. Are there other issues that the caucus plans to address this season?
So we have a number of issues that we addressed, and one of the things we have brought in, it's a new initiative to bring kosher halal food into the New York City public school system. And this is how we work together. This is how myself, as an Orthodox Jew, advocating for not only the Jewish community, but for the communities who are disenfranchised, working together side by side with the Jewish community and the Muslim community here in New York City. And this brings the relationships of different cultures together. And these are some of the things I promote in the New York City Council by working with other people representing different religions and different cultures, and working together. Because when somebody wants to attack all of us, there's nothing they can do. They will not defeat us. We need to work together and work together closely and promote what New York City is all about. It's a city of immigrants. It's a city of people representing different cultures, and this is what's important.
And as we wrap up, we've got about a minute or so left. How can people learn more about you, your work, and also some of the legislation that you'll be having hearings on?
Well, they could definitely join me on Facebook. I put a lot of social media things that I do on Facebook. It's Councilman Chaim Deutsch. They could also follow me on Twitter at Chaim Deutsch, ChaimDeutsch, or they could call my office and sign up for my report. And there's a lot of things that we have done over the last 5 years in New York City Council in regards to promoting and bringing the services and resources to the Jewish community. I have been elected to chair the Jewish Caucus just a little over a year ago. A lot has been done. We still have a lot more to do. And this is not about me being the chair of the Jewish Caucus. It's a partnership with the 8.6 million New Yorkers. And when we all work together, we can accomplish big things.
And I asked our last guest this as well. Final thoughts on what you believe on a day like today. What message do you think people should hear?
The message is that we are a city. We are a city of immigrants, and we need to respect each other. We need to work together, and we need to work together to bring tolerance and keep peace, not only here in New York City, but come up with ideas to bring peace and tolerance throughout the country.
New York City Council member Chaim Deutsch, thank you very much for joining me, Jeff Simmons, here on WBAI's City Watch this afternoon.
Thank you, Jeff.
So in a few moments, we're going to bring on one of our co-hosts who will be calling in from Washington, D.C., Bich Ha Pham, and then also our final guest, who will be Ralph McCloud, director of the Catholic Campaign for Human Development. But just as we wrap up our discussion about Holocaust Remembrance Day, the Holocaust, as you know, is the best documented case of genocide, but it's been impossible to know exactly how many people were killed as a result of Nazi policies. And there's no one document that spells this out. I was combing websites this weekend and I saw a number of variations. But scholars, governmental agencies, and Jewish organizations relied on a number of records to try to present an accurate estimate. And what seemed to be consistent was the estimate that 6 million Jews, 7 million Soviet citizens, 1.8 non-Jewish Polish citizens, and hundreds of thousands of Serb civilians, people with disabilities, Roma, Jehovah's Witnesses, German political opponents, LGBT individuals, and more were killed. And at Auschwitz alone, which we had talked about, it's estimated about 1.1 million people had been killed from May 1940 to January of 1945. With that, I'd like to bring up my co-host calling in from Washington, D.C., Bich Ha. Bich Ha, how is it going today?
Hey, Jeff. Good. Other than, obviously, the topics we're talking about, which is very important, but very sad as well.
So, obviously, since you're in D.C., you know what I want to ask you is what you have witnessed as far as the federal shutdown, and I'm sure this is a topic of discussion. What is going on?
Yeah, I'm so glad that there's at least a temporary, hopefully permanent solution. I mean, it's been surreal being in D.C. these past couple of weeks. Getting on the express bus in the mornings, right in the middle of rush hour, and having 3 other people on the bus with you, all the way into the city, going to restaurants where you're like the second table, the only second table in the restaurant, and I do have friends who've been furloughed, and they're they have mortgages, they have car payments, and friends who are contractors that agencies, businesses that do have government contracts, and they're even worse off. So it's I feel bad. A friend of mine, her boyfriend manages the restaurant on Capitol Hill, and he says that they've been devastated by what these past several weeks. Like their business has dropped tremendously. So you worry about these small businesses too that weren't able. How are they going to be able to continue with the rest of the month and the next month, given all the, as you probably know, the small businesses, they really are on a shoestring budget, and especially restaurants with such low margins of profit. So it's it's been a very trying time for everybody, and I'm glad that, like I said, we have hopefully a permanent solution. But it's upsetting to see, I think, that when you see Trump administration officials so disconnected to working people and their struggles, and the comments they've made and the decisions they've made.
So, and with that, I believe we have our final guest on the line. Would you like to introduce him, Bich Ha?
Yes, great. So our final guest today is Ralph McCloud. He's the director of the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, which is the national anti-poverty program of the U.S. Catholic bishops. And CCHD works to break the cycle of poverty by helping low-income people participate in decision-making that affect their lives, families, and communities, which is, I think, a really, really amazing mission and goal. So welcome to our show, Ralph.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Great. So I've talked a little bit about the mission and work of the Catholic Campaign for Human Development. Can you give us a little bit more background?
Sure, I'd be happy to. We've been around right around 50 years, and the bishops, when they formed it, thought we did a pretty good job in our schools and our hospitals, our homeless shelters, but there was still something missing, and that was the importance of empowering low-income people to be able to speak for themselves in the civic arena, in the marketplace, and other places. So they set aside resources that they would do to have grants for low-income community organizing and economic development, where the people who participate, the people who are low-income themselves, will be the ones to give voice to bringing themselves up out of poverty. And they also had a second component that they wanted to lift up, the importance of people who don't understand the dimensions or understand the reality of poverty, having an opportunity to walk with these folks for lack of a better phrase, crossing over the bridge to see where they are and to assist them and to see the realities in a way that you just don't really see with the polarization that we have experienced over the last 50 years.
So you're one of the sponsoring organizations for the National Poverty Awareness Month in January. What's the extent of the poverty issue?
Poverty, I think, is significant. I think we heard a lot about that with the government shutdowns here in the United States, about how folks struggle with being just one paycheck from being homeless and being on the streets. And those are folks who are fortunate enough to have employment and jobs. But the reality of 1 in 5 children in the nation today being in poverty, somewhere around 36 to 38 million people who live daily below the poverty line, who aren't on anybody's radar. And I think efforts like the Catholic Campaign for Human Development aims to surface those folks and bring them to the forefront to allow them to speak for themselves and what best would help them deal and address the poverty that they find themselves in. And it could be anything from the lack of affordable housing or employment or education or any of those kinds of things that keep folks mired in poverty.
So as part of your National Poverty Awareness Month, what are some of the activities that have been going on, and what do you hope to achieve through those acts?
Sure. Well, we set aside January as National Poverty Awareness Month because we're coming off of the holidays and Christmas, and folks are feeling pretty good. But folks also become aware of folks' needs as well, and they're oftentimes more generous. And we hope to lift up just how poverty, the implications of poverty, how it affects folks, but also the prevalence that it still exists, is still very, very high in a nation that has the kinds of resources that we have. And folks are generous when they have a better awareness of it. Selfishly, I think that all 12 months ought to be poverty awareness, that we ought to keep that on our minds as long as there's anybody in our communities that are struggling, that we ought to have a significant awareness. And because of that awareness, act on their behalf.
So we're talking about the awareness. I'm curious then what some of the solutions would be. What are some of the solutions that the campaign is advocating for?
Sure. I think some of the bigger solutions are that we hear time and time again from the folks who we work with, the importance of employment, job employment, being able to support families, the importance of having health care, the importance of having quality education and quality housing. So we find the folks we have the blessing of being able to work with, who will come together to work on all of those types of initiatives, all aimed at not just bringing themselves up out of poverty, but bringing their entire communities up out of poverty. So they walk together in trying to achieve affordable housing. They walk together in trying to secure employment and oftentimes transportation to gainful employment, to look together to try to deal with some of the oppressive and difficult laws that are working towards keeping people down, particularly around targeting immigrants. So all of those kinds of things that keep folks in poverty invites the faithful to share an opportunity of participating in solidarity with them to assist in bringing them out of poverty.
One of the things I read about on your webpage is that Poverty USA, which is a project of the USCCB, participated in the U.S. World Meeting of Popular Movements, and the speakers there addressed some of the themes that you've talked about: racism, immigration, environmental justice, labor and housing. So can you tell us more about this area in terms of the popular movements and what happened at that event?
Sure. Well, there was an initiative of Pope Francis that actually began at the Vatican, and he had one that was in Bolivia and another one that came back to Rome, and then the fourth one was a regional one that was here in the United States, where we invited people from all over the country to identify things that were keeping them in poverty, and what we refer to as protagonistas or protagonists, people who were grassroots, people who were actually hands-on, who were struggling with poverty, to come together and have church leaders come and listen to a group of people who talked about their struggles, who participated in small groups with their struggles, who participated in plenary sections to share their struggles. And we had it kind of divided among the lines that you mentioned, among racism and the environment and housing and labor, trabajo, techo, and tierra, as they referred to it. And focused on those particular areas and came up with some tremendous innovations and solutions, and encouraged folks to go back to their communities and work in different ways, and shared best practices, and built a sense of solidarity, I think, between the low-income people and some of the church leaders from around the country.
So I've kind of got a two-part question. The first one goes to something Bich Ha and I were speaking about right before we brought you on. We were talking about the shutdown, and I'm curious what the Catholic Campaign for Human Development might have been doing over the last few weeks, if anything, to assist those who've been affected by the shutdown. And then I'll follow up with just one other question about the administration. But that's been foremost on my mind, is how you've been able to connect with those who've been affected by the shutdown.
Sure. Just by default, a lot of the folks who were government employees were, from what we understand, were participating in some of our funded groups around the country already, long before the shutdown, and that they understood and helped other folks who had found themselves in poverty. I think that the Conference of Bishops themselves spoke out about the importance of trying to work towards not building a wall. Understand the importance of border security, but that the wall was something that was holding employees in the United States, as well as those persons who were kind of downstream of the employees. We heard a lot about the 800,000 employees, but folks who were contractors, folks who worked at some of the places, like the housing places where people were having to defer their rent or housing payments and those kinds of things. Those persons were affected who won't be receiving back pay. So having them to participate with our funded groups who are working on lobbying, advocating on their behalf is something that we'll see some of our funded groups do.
And the second part involving the administration really has been, like Trump and his administration are known for their connections with the corporate worlds. How do you get through? How does the Catholic Campaign for Human Development kind of get through to get poverty, at the top of the agenda, and to get some tangible, workable solutions to help those in the country that are facing poverty?
I think the biggest thing that the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, it has a reputation for bringing people together I think what we've seen over the years, that individually, it's very difficult to penetrate some of the large corporations or large civic or government institutions, organizations. But when people come together, as we've seen in a lot of situations around the country historically, people come together when they have a shared interest. They're able to get the attention of larger institutions, be they government, business, corporate, or otherwise, and not just to kind of appeal to their bottom line, but also appealing to the morality and appealing to the shared humanity that my salvation is wrapped up in your salvation. My survival is wrapped up in your survival. And I think, that when we're able to appeal to those values with people who are in corporate or civic or government institutions, there's a sympathy, I think, that oftentimes comes that doesn't come in any other way.
So, Ralph, I went to the webpage for the Catholic Campaign for Human Development and the National Poverty Awareness Month and saw that there were a number of good tools that you were urging the parishes and congregations to engage in. So can you, how can people learn more about that work? And can you share our website and maybe point out a few things on your website?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Well, the Poverty Awareness Month, particularly during Poverty Awareness Month, we encourage people to respond to Pope Francis' challenge to listen attentively to the needs of those persons who are poverty. And we have an online print calendar that's also available in Spanish, which includes daily ways of learning a little bit more about poverty. And we encourage people to do that along with their families, so the young people also can be inspired to see how communities are responding and to invite them to look at ways that they might be able to respond themselves. In addition, we have daily reflections that hundreds of people will come and come to our website and see the reflections. We send those out to around 1,100 people every day, and thousands of people have interacted with us on social media through povertyusa.org.
So Ralph McCloud,
we'd invite the listeners to participate as well.
Ralph McCloud, Director of the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, thank you for joining Bich Ha and myself here on City Watch this afternoon.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Good luck. God bless.
Thank you. So, Bich Ha, thank you so much, and I look forward to speaking with you again next month. But, of course, we'll talk offline between now and then.
Thanks, Jeff.
And good luck with the shutdown. Hopefully this is over.
Yes.
So another edition of City Watch is coming to a close. I want to thank our guests today, in addition to Bich Ha, our co-host, the Museum of Jewish Heritage Board Chair Bruce Ratner, New York City Council Member Chaim Deutsch, and Ralph McCloud of the Catholic Campaign for Human Development. I also want to thank our engineer Sean for another wonderful performance on the boards, and thank you especially to our listeners for supporting this show. We're simply unable to do this without your generosity. Remember, if you missed any part of today's show or just want to listen to it again, the MP3 download is available at www.wbai.org. You just have to click on Archives and then City Watch. The show will be up and ready online in about 10 minutes and be up for 90 days. That's it for today. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.